Hey guys, today let's build a Dragonfly. This turned out to be a way trickier piece than I anticipated for a few reasons, but we'll get into those later. I always start by going through some of my parts and finding things that I think will work well. I want to get a bit of variety here so I can play around with them before committing to any particular pieces. I based the scale here off some wings that I cut out of circuit boards almost a decade ago, and as it turns out, Dragonfly wings don't look anything like that, so I end up having to remake them later, meaning the scale here was kind of pointless. I've got some parts that I'm happy with for the thorax, which I'll use as a starting point for the piece. I'm trying a few other parts here and there for the abdomen to try and imagine how it will look all together. I want a slightly different angle here, so I'm trying to find a piece that will slot in nicely and give the body almost a bit of a hunched over look. This part worked really nicely, so it's time to start welding. One day I'll figure out how to get my exposure right so it doesn't look this bright on camera, but that day's not today. I've got these parts loosely attached and I'm just checking the angles work with the other piece before strengthening the welds. Happy with that, I join it to the rest of the thorax. I've added a couple of small nails to the inside just to build up some more welded connections for strength. I pointlessly checked how this looked with the wings that I didn't realise I wouldn't be using, and happy with that, I continued searching for more parts that might work to continue building up the abdomen. I got very distracted by this strange centre of gravity that the thorax now had, and wasted significantly more time than I want to admit by playing with it. Now here I actually looked at a picture of a Dragonfly for the first time during this build. As it turns out, this should always be the first step, and it was then that I kind of started to realise the wing shape was something straight out of my imagination rather than nature. I also found this nice golden part that was completely wrong and I never used despite my clear enthusiasm for it here. I decided to use one of these long screws for the abdomen, which was a much better call and way more anatomically accurate. To get it attached, I needed to fit it to a washer that was the same diameter as the base of the thorax. My attempts to tack weld them together were wildly unsuccessful, so I went back to arc welding instead. I checked it was straight-ish, and convinced I couldn't do any better, I continued to add more welds to build a stronger joint. Because I was doing so much welding here, the screw was getting really hot, hence the pliers I used to hold it instead. I also added a few small metal pieces just to give me some more points of contact to the weld and make it that little bit stronger. With the abdomen done, I moved on to the head. Dragonfly heads are basically just two big eyeballs, and I didn't have anything spherical that was the right size, so I decided to cut the ends off two gas canisters that I'd found on the street, leaving me with two halves of a sphere that I thought would work pretty well. They weren't quite the same size and the Dremel had left a rough cut, so I sanded them both down until I was happy with the symmetry. An old nut works as a way to space them apart and would hold them at the angle I wanted. This looked good with the thorax, so I went back to working on the abdomen as a form of procrastination. At first, when I tried welding the parts together, I wasn't actually getting anywhere, and I figured this might be because the washer had some sort of plating or finish that was stopping me from getting a good weld. I sanded it down and this seemed to fix it. After checking it was on straight, I got to work welding around the entire joint. I use a jewelry spot welder, which means this was hundreds of welds and took so much longer than my editing makes it seem. Now, I was really happy with the piece so far, but it was overwhelmingly silver, and I wanted to break this up a little bit. So I decided to add some parts with a gold colour. I couldn't actually weld these parts, so opted for some superglue instead, as they weren't structurally important, so they didn't need to be as strong as the rest of the piece. As you can see, this went really well and had no issues whatsoever. After carefully adding some superglue, I started threading the parts over the abdomen. This was a bit tedious as I just kept messing up with the superglue. I also wasn't totally happy with this design, so I tried out a few different variations. I really like this piece that I could use to highlight some circuit board components that I was planning to add later. I thought that looked way better, so I superglued it in place properly this time, managing to avoid bonding too much of my skin to the metal. This looked good with the head, so procrastination over, I went back to working on it, welding the two halves of the sphere to the nut, making sure that I actually got it vaguely symmetrical. At the moment, it wasn't looking very much like a bug, so I found a very bug-like part that would make a good mandible and gently welded it to a circuit board component, making sure not to burn straight through the more delicate metal by reducing the voltage on the welder. Okay, maybe a little bit too gently. After whacking the voltage up, I managed to get the two parts joined nicely. I needed more parts to bulk out the head and cover up where I had cut the eyes out. This part looked like it would do that, and I wanted to bring some of the gold color to the head to kind of tie the piece together and make it feel more connected to the abdomen. Once I'd flattened it and made it really easy to pick up, I cut it in half so it would fit onto the head properly, which made it even easier to pick up. I sanded the edge down so it didn't look as rough and gathered all the parts I thought I'd need to complete the head. To get the gold piece to sit flush with the curve of the eyes was a real pain, and it took a load of minor adjustments to get it right. It was one of those cases where you'd compare it, make a small adjustment, compare it, adjustment, and it was just way more tedious than this makes it look. I also took another one of the parts I'd used on the abdomen, so I'd be able to add a similar green highlight on the head. I superglued these parts together, managing to avoid my fingers entirely this time. I added some metal bits here and there just to increase the points of contact and surface area that the glue was working on. Gluing the mandible on was really easy, and once it was attached I thought it was actually starting to look like a bug, which was great because that was kind of the whole thing I was going for here. Now here I had a problem. The metal wasn't weldable, so I was going to really struggle attaching the head and the legs. What I did have though were some tiny screws which were weldable, and more importantly I could screw directly into the unweldable part. What my terrible camera angle doesn't make obvious here was that I needed 6 of the same screws to act as a base of the legs that I'd be making later. After finding a set that matched, I started welding them on one at a time, using that tiny weldable point as an anchor. I could then weld the other screws to each other and link them while welding the back pair to the section of the thorax that was made of weldable metal. Getting the symmetry here was pretty important as I wanted the legs to come off at the same angles on each side. This actually worked way better than I thought it was going to, and it wasn't too tricky considering most of the metal that I was working with here was not weldable at all. I also finally printed off an actual picture of a dragonfly to use as a reference, which again is something I should definitely have been using from the very start. I started thinking about how to do the legs and hit a bit of a wall, so figured I'd just call it a day and surely by tomorrow I'd have figured it all out. I feel like it's been ages since I actually made something, so today, let's build something. Okay, so maybe tomorrow turned into next week, which turned into next month, and before I knew it, a year had gone by. The legs had just completely thrown me off, and after trying a bunch of variations that I wasn't happy with, I gave up. I was pretty annoyed with how much time I had wasted, so decided to give up on making the perfect legs and just make anything. I went in with a pretty simple design, a couple of nails with some bends to make them more lifelike. You can see here how many welds each joint takes, so you can imagine how incredibly boring this is to repeat 6 times. As I made each one, I had to make sure the angles were all symmetrical so I wouldn't end up with a wonky dragonfly when I added them on. I also wanted some of the leg pairs to be slightly different in size as well as leg positioning and the angles I'd be attaching them. This process was mainly trial and error, just comparing them to the body and making small adjustments. I didn't want to get too hung up on making them perfect and lose another year, so with the body giving off a lens flare that would make JJ Abrams jealous, I forced myself to start welding them on. I definitely didn't love the design at this point. I was still making adjustments in the size and angles as I went, but quickly had 2 legs attached. Now, I needed to weld the other side, making sure that it was symmetrical, as well as making sure the whole piece wouldn't be lopsided when it was standing. This went pretty well for the front leg, and I figured the next one would be reasonably quick as well. I was wrong, so I made a couple of adjustments that would definitely fix it. I was wrong again. This continued for some time until I finally got it right and the 4 legs were attached and looking good. I strengthened all the welds and got the piece set up to attach the final 2 legs. Now that the Dragonfly could stand on its own feet, I could take my welder freehand and weld the back legs on in situ, so the angles would be perfect. Once it was loosely attached, I could then finish up welding from all angles through the microscope, making it really strong. With only 1 leg to go, I was wondering why this had taken me over a year to get round to, and distracted by the weight of my own failure, I forgot to attach the ground electrode. This took way too long for me to realise, and only added to this weight. After forgiving myself and attaching the final leg, I went and strengthened the joint. Feeling on a roll, I moved on to the head, adding a couple of really important parts that would allow me to weld it to the body. I had to make sure that these lined up perfectly and also stayed small enough that it wasn't going to get in the way of the actual head design. Just like with the legs, I needed to use some weldable screws as anchor points to attach the head, bypassing the non-weldable metal. These were vaguely irritating to screw in as I had somehow misplaced my screwdriver for the 10th time that day. Once in, they lined up perfectly with the 2 bits of metal that I had added to each side of the head earlier. This allowed me to easily attach the head, and it was actually looking a bit like a dragonfly. It had these big gaps on either side of the body that I wasn't really a fan of, so decided to plug them up. Annoyingly, the non-weldable piece had a magnetic component inside, which meant I kept losing the parts and having to dig them back out. This happened a lot more times than I'd like to admit. The first side welded in nicely and did a great job, but the second side was a tiny bit tighter, so I had to sand down the edge a little so the part would fit. I may have overdone it a bit, so the magnet came back to haunt me with a vengeance, but eventually I got it fixed in place. There's really only one big thing left to do, so let's make some wings. Over the year-long break, I'd come to terms with the old set of wings being terrible and started designing new ones. I used card first, comparing designs to the body and making adjustments here and there until I thought they looked right. I also made sure to look at an actual picture of a dragonfly before doing any of this. I ended up deciding to make 2 variations, with the front set of wings being larger and slightly thicker. With my templates cut out, I took a scrap piece of circuit board I'd already stripped and started laying out the templates to make sure I'd be able to get all 4 wings out of it. My studio is windowless and as a result unventilated, so I set up a cutting station outside to save my lungs from inhaling incredibly toxic PCB dust. Cutting the wings was pretty easy, but I only had 1 cutting disc left and I quickly started to run into a problem. The more I cut, the smaller the disc was getting, to the point where I could barely get all the way through the board. I managed to scrape through by the skin of my teeth and started cleaning up the form with my bench sander. You might also be able to tell that the disc sander here is really worn out, which really slowed things down. But being an incredibly disorganized man, again, I was down to my last one, so there wasn't too much to do about that. Once I got the shapes matching the template, I sanded the pairs together to make sure they were exactly the same shape. This worked really well to make sure they were as symmetrical as possible. I also gave up on the bench sander at the end. I vaguely positioned them how I wanted and was really happy with how they looked, so started work on getting them attached. I have loads of these old picture frame hangers which work great as hinges, and I wanted to be able to position the wings in different poses. Obviously the circuit board itself, I can't weld directly to it, so to attach these I drilled a hole in each wing so I could bolt them to the hinges. For some reason, while I was working out the positioning, I thought I needed to drill the hole in a different spot on the lower wings. The second hole was A, worse, and B, entirely unnecessary, so I didn't use it and I still have no idea why I thought I needed it. I found some screws that fitted perfectly and 2 accompanying nuts. Those of you who are good at maths will realise that leaves me with a bit of a problem. After checking all my parts for another 2 that would fit and coming up dry, I was reduced to searching through one of my many unsorted boxes. This took ages and I almost gave up, but eventually I had 2 that fitted. I checked that I could attach the wings at good angles and again tried to avoid procrastination and just started welding. Happy with the angle, I went to strengthen the joint and promptly fused my electrode to the sculpture. After a little bit of work, I was able to free it and continued just really making sure that that wing was on as strongly as possible. This mainly involved welding from as many different angles as I could, so that when I added the second wing, it wouldn't get in the way and prevent me from doing any of the key welding I needed to do. Once that was done, I added the second wing. Repeating this on the second side is always harder because this time I've got to match something exactly, instead of getting a vague angle correct. This makes it seem like I did it really quickly, but that's because I didn't think you guys would love an hour of me intently staring and moving wings by a millimeter back and forth. That being said, this actually honestly didn't take as long as I thought it would, and with all the wings attached, I was really loving how it looked. I wanted to make sure they were really strongly attached as they'd be getting moved a lot, so went over the welds a bunch of times. Apparently I wasn't paying very much attention because I managed to weld 2 of the wings together, meaning I couldn't move them independently anymore, which was really annoying to separate as I didn't want to break any other parts, so couldn't apply too much pressure. Eventually I got them apart and carefully re-welded all the important bits. This was followed by some of that intense staring I mentioned earlier, as I checked it looked right from all angles. I added some extra nails here to give the legs more stability, as I wasn't confident that they were attached as well as they could be, and didn't want to have any issues now they were supporting the weight of the wings as well. I'd also love to know if you guys actually like seeing these welding montages, or if it just gets a bit boring for you. The last thing to do was add the details. This is always my favourite bit, adding small circuit board components, mainly to give a pop of colour. Here I went for bright green and pale blue highlights. I quite often get questions about where I actually get these parts from. In a lot of my videos, I show myself picking up bits of scrap metal that I find on the street out and about, but you don't really get to see any of these circuit board components. These I get from taking apart old electronic devices that either I find ready to be thrown away or people donate them to me. I take these apart and that's where I get all of these really amazing, beautiful circuit board components that I use to sort of decorate pieces at the end. I felt like the wings looked a little boring, so unscrewed them while working on adding some components to break up the look of the green circuit boards. I used similar colours to the body, adding some silver and gold parts and incorporating more of the green and blue resistors for colour. A really important thing to do here is to not use too much super glue. Obviously I can't weld these parts because a lot of them aren't metallic, but if I overdo it on the super glue then you get this sort of misty discoloration and it really ruins the look of the piece. So you just got to use exactly as much as you have to. Once I had some nice symmetrical wings, I reattached them and I was finally done. I honestly can't believe that this piece took me so long to make, but I'm so happy with how it turned out and I hope you guys like it. I'd love to know what you guys think of the piece and also what you'd like to see me make next. I also want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon subscribers. You guys are the best and I really appreciate the support. Oh, also like and subscribe because apparently that's really important. So yeah, thanks, bye.